Alright, now we've come to the moment that you've all been waiting for, the engagement engine. Before we delve into the codebase, it's useful to know that people used to refer to the engagements engine as the engagements plugin. But that's a bit of a misnomer. There's no such thing as a plugin for engagements, even though the codebase resides in the plugin directory. The engagement engine does, however, house 3 plugins. If you want to be pedantic about it, you could say that the name plugin refers to that old method of extending Rails before gems were a thing. But that's not where the name came from. These engines were never Rails plugins in that sense of the word. Okay, so the 3 plugins that make up this engagement engine are the signup form, the sweeps, and the user-generated content plugin. The most basic one is the signup form. It creates a web form with fields like name, email address, and birthday, and lets business users put these forms on their templates so that consumers can submit their forms. The sweepstakes plugin adds a little bit of functionality to the signup form. It lets consumers enter for a chance to win a sweepstakes. Effectively, all that means is that the sweepstakes lets business users select winners and lets them specify a few sweepstakes-like things such as rules and prizes. The latest plugin, the user-generated plugin, adds even more functionality on top of the sweepstakes plugin. It lets users upload their own photos or videos and then lets other users vote on them. Given that all of these plugins allow consumers to enter data, it's not hard to imagine that they have a lot of other stuff in common. For example, the form fields are customizable in each plugin. In particular, the engine has 16 built-in field types that business users can mix and match to meet their needs. A lot of the fields even come with special logic, like the birthday field, which requires that entrants be at least 13 years old, or the street address field, which might require that the consumer reside in a particular country. Some of the fields are even more generic, like a text box field or a drop-down field. Another important commonality is the ability to share links to the form on networks like Facebook, Google+, or Twitter. Finally, each plugin lets business users download a CSV version of form entries. Okay, let's go over some of the settings and options in a little more detail. We'll use the signup form for this discussion because all 3 plugins have most of the functionality that the signup form has. We'll talk about the sweeps and UGC plugins briefly toward the end of the video. When you open the edit section of the signup form, you get a form settings page. And on that form settings page, you get a tabbed interface whose first tab lists the default form fields. Here, users can sort fields, add and delete fields, and change their settings, such as marking them required or modifying drop-down options. The Thank You tab is sort of our way of telling business users that they really should at least thank customers for submitting their information. It has a rich text field where business users type in a thank you message. It lets business users upload thank you codes in case business users want to give away coupons, or it lets them redirect users to a custom URL after consumers submit the form. The Sharing tab does exactly what it says it does. It lets users specify which networks and which pages on those networks the form can be shared to. Now we get to the Settings tab, because clearly none of the other tabs change any settings. This one adds limitations on entry submittal. For example, some forms might let users submit the forms more than once. It also lets users change the default validation messages. Last but not least, the Leads tab lets business users view entries or download a CSV with all of the consumer's submitted information. Great. Now that you have a good understanding of what the core features are, let's talk about the code. We'll use the models structure for this discussion, but the controllers also use a similar structure. First, when navigating the code base, you'll notice that the majority of the implementation is in the engagements folder. There, you'll find models like field types, which describe birthday fields, name fields, street address fields. You'll also find models like form, which is one of the main models, and entry, which stores entries for user submittals. Next, we have the combination of folders where 2 plugins share similar functionality. For example, the signup form and sweeps plugins share a lot of the same functionality, and the sweeps and UGC plugin also share some functionality. Finally, we have the most specific models, which are the models that individual plugins use for their core functionality. Here you see that we have an engagements base model, and all it does is it sets the table name prefix and plugin name. And then the subsequent models effectively just include modules from the folders we just talked about. Let's talk about the entity relationships a little bit, because that'll help you rationalize how the entire engagements plugin works. So as we mentioned before, every plugin starts out with an app model. In the case of the signup form, it has forms. Now, when we first implemented the engagement signup form plugin, we thought we would need the capability to embed multiple forms inside a single plugin. But that turned out not to be as useful as we thought it would be. So you can disregard that asterisk next to forms, even though that's how the relationship is defined. Now, each form has multiple fields, and the fields are just things like first name, last name, address, email, etc. It also has entries, which are what users submit. So every time a form gets submitted, we create a new entry. And it has warnings. Warnings are effectively validation messages. Now let's talk about those thank you codes for a minute. When a business user creates thank you codes, she attaches those codes to the form. But then when a consumer submits forms, the thank you codes get attached to the entries. So that's why we have the two-way relationship there between thank you codes and entries, and thank you codes and forms. Now, entries are actually stored in MongoDB. And we store them in MongoDB because when we create the plugin, we're not sure what the structure of the fields in that plugin is going to be. For example, some of the fields actually have subfields. So let's take an address field, for example. An address field has a street number, a city, a state, and a zip. And we store those in nested fields. Entries also have many entry plugin engagements. The entry plugin engagement is effectively an identifier for the consumer that submitted the form. Every time a consumer submits a form, we create a new entry plugin engagement and tie that to the entry. And then we use that entry plugin engagement to make sure that the consumer has not submitted multiple entries within the allotted time period. Finally, verification codes are used when users are required to validate that they've completed some task before submitting their form. In this case, we have a similar relationship to the thank you codes, where a field might be a verification code and it can accept one of many verification codes, and then an entry also has a verification code, meaning that verification code has been used. So you could also technically use this as a form of validation. You can validate that consumers don't submit the same verification code twice. That is, they don't submit the form twice. One of the other things you've probably noticed if you've already looked at the engagements folder is the additional folders that they have that are not part of standard Rails. Let's go over those really quick. The audit folder was created for account management. This feature keeps track of who publishes pages, who unpublishes pages, and so forth. The caches folder really only helps out in two locations. First, the thank you code management. So every time a user submits a form, we remove a thank you code from the Redis cache. And for managing the count of the UGC votes. It turns out that if we try to update the vote counter in the MySQL database every time somebody submits a vote, we incur some major performance hits. So we have a Redis cache for that. Now, for long-term management of all of these vote counts, we also keep a count in the MySQL database. And we have a separate rescue task that actually updates the count on the MySQL database with the latest count in the Redis cache. The liquid folder is where we keep the logic of what gets exposed at the template level. We call those liquid drops. We haven't talked about liquid drops very much, but effectively they're standard Ruby objects that are made available to liquid templates. And the objects are really just standard Ruby classes with all of the unused and potentially dangerous methods removed. From the user's perspective, a drop acts very much like a hash, though methods are accessed with dot notation as well as element selection. Also, drop methods cannot be invoked with arguments. And finally, they're called just-in-time, meaning objects get lazy loaded. The log subscriber folder houses all of the statsd notifications that we send out to Graphite. You've probably seen this data being used as part of the Giraffe dashboard that we use once in a while to keep track of performance. The presenters folder manages the state of the UGC entry view. That is, when business users look at the leads that their form has generated, they can paginate and sort and do all sorts of stuff with that list. We use presenters to manage that view. Last but not least, we have uploaders. AppSuite itself has its own configuration for carrier wave, but for the engagements engine, we need a slightly different configuration so that we can store entries in a particular location. Okay, now you're probably ready to talk about the signup form's cousins, the sweeps and UGC plugins, in more detail. Let's start with the sweeps. The sweepstakes plugin adds prize information, which is a really simple text field that just explains what the user gets if he submits the sweepstakes form. It also adds a sort of timeline functionality that shows either pre-entry period text, the regular form itself, or post-entry text. And this helps business customers not have to manually change the sweepstakes throughout its lifetime. You can go into the page one time, set these fields, and then forget about the sweepstakes. It'll just run itself. It also adds rules and regulation requirements, which are effectively just text fields again, and it lets users automatically select a random winner. But as far as the structure for the sweepstakes plugins, there's not a lot of complexity compared to the signup form. The UGC plugin is a little more involved. It has almost all the functionality that you just heard about from the sweeps plugin, and adds even a little more. Keep in mind, though, that a lot of these features were added because Promo Builder was shutting down, and we promised clients that they'd have a Promo Builder replacement soon. For starters, as we said before, the UGC plugin lets users submit content that will later be voted on by other users. This means that the UGC plugin needs two timelines, one for submitting entries, which in addition to user identifying information also has to handle photos and videos, and the second to handle voting of those submittals. It also adds the ability for business users to accept or reject entry submittals. This is important if you're a tobacco company or if some of your users want to upload photos that violate Facebook's terms of service. To facilitate this approval and rejection of entries, the UGC plugin also lets users paginate and sort entry submittals. The other plugins also allowed users to paginate, but only by refreshing the entire page. The UGC adds a nice little Ajax pagination, which makes using it a little bit easier. And the last big thing for this plugin is the fact that it exposes a JavaScript API. The JavaScript API lets business users paginate through entries on the consumer side. So the pagination that we had just talked about was for the business side. We can also do that on the consumer side now much more easily. But this pagination comes with some implications. For example, in most forms, users will be asked to submit their birth date. But showing a user's birth date is both poor form and against Facebook's terms of service. So to prevent nefarious users from getting access to sensitive data, the UGC plugin has a public setting on each field. If the field is marked as public, then it shows up in the JavaScript API. Otherwise, it doesn't. One last tweak that we did for the UGC plugin has to do with optimizing the consumer rendering side. Promo Builder was able to handle a huge amount of traffic, partially because we had so many nodes dedicated to it. But AppSuite can't handle as many, even though we have so many nodes. And because of how Liquid is rendered, it's really difficult to cache a bunch of pages in AppSuite. For example, every time a user votes on something, or every time a new submittal is made, we'd have to cache a new page. So in order to improve performance, we compromised. Instead of caching the entire page and all variants of the page, or not caching any of it at all, for the UGC plugin only, we're caching the very first page of the entry submittals. And this brings me to another point. If users are going to vote for entries in a contest, then you probably don't want all of the entries to appear in the same order all the time. If they do, then the first few submittals will always get a lot of attention, and then subsequent pages will get barely any votes. So to fix that, Yworks added 4 fields called random number to the entries table. Those fields are used to change the order that entries appear in for consumers. So let's say that a user lands on a page that has a user-generated content plugin, and he sees the very first page of entries. In the background, AppSuite is ordering those entries by one of those 4 random value fields. For example, it will pick random value field number 1 and then order all of the entries either in ascending or descending order on that field. Then, to make sure that users don't see varying orders every time they load a page, we keep track of that in a little cookie. So in all, when users visit a page that has the user-generated content plugin, they may see one of 8 different entry orders.